Blood coated the altimeter. Outside, 70 armed hostiles closed in on the downed Osprey. Inside, the surviving SEALs braced for a final stand. Their commander stared at the dead pilots, screaming a desperate question into the smoke. When she stood up, the gunfire didn't stop them cold. She did. Gravity stopped being a constant and became a weapon. The CV-22. Osprey didn't fall so much as it was swatted from the sky. A surface-to-air missile had clipped the right propeller, severing the hydraulic lines and turning a $60 million feat of aviation engineering into a 30-ton brick of titanium and composites. Inside the troop cabin, the world inverted. Carla Davies clamped her jaw tight, tasting copper. The 4-point harness dug into her collarbones with enough force to bruise bone. Beside her, Chief Thatcher Powell gripped the nylon webbing of his seat, his knuckles white beneath his tactical gloves. No one screamed. There was only the deafening mechanical shriek of tearing metal, the urgent blare of the master warning alarms, and the sickening sensation of freefall. Through the rear ramp's small porthole, the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush spun in a chaotic carousel. Brace. The command wasn't spoken. It was a collective tightening of muscle and resolve. They hit the ridgeline. The impact was a physical detonation. The landing gear sheared off instantly. The fuselage slammed into the granite, bouncing once, twice, before ploughing a deep, jagged trench through the snow and rock. Sparks cascaded past the windows in brilliant, violent sheets. The noise was absolute, a grinding, crushing roar that vibrated through Carla's boots and rattled her teeth in her skull. Then, violent deceleration. The aircraft slammed into a heavy snowbank, snapping the remaining left wing forward. The cabin lights flickered, died, and were replaced by the eerie, weak glow of the emergency strips. Silence rushed in, heavy and ringing. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The smell of JP-8 aviation fuel flooded the cabin, thick and acrid, cutting through the ozone and dust. "Sound off," Powell grunted, his voice rasping through the smoke. Carla unbuckled her harness. She dropped to the angled deck, her boots crunching on shattered structural composites. "Davies, up!" "O'Connor, up! Left arm's busted," came a tight groan from the shadows. "Ford, up!" "Hensley?" A pause, followed by a wet cough. "Up. Barely." Out of the 8-man team, 5 were breathing. The other 3 were silent, their bodies slumped against the harnesses, necks bent at angles that required no medical assessment. Carla didn't look at them for more than a fraction of a second. Grief was a luxury reserved for the tarmac back at Begram. Here, it was a liability. "Perimeter," Powell ordered, unspooling a fresh tourniquet for O'Connor. Carla racked the charging handle of her MK-18. She moved over the tilted deck, her balance perfect despite the awkward 20-degree list of the fuselage. She kicked the jammed side door. It didn't budge. Stepping back, she drove her heel into the locking mechanism. The door gave way, groaning on bent hinges, and the biting mountain air rushed in, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of shouting. Hostiles. A lot of them. Carla peered through the fractured opening, her optics scanning the tree line below the ridge. Thermal signatures flared orange against the cold blue of the terrain. 10, 20. She kept counting. They were moving in a loose crescent formation, bounding up the slope. They knew exactly what had fallen from the sky, and they knew the prize waiting inside. "We have company," Carla said, her voice flat. "Platoon plus, moving up the south draw. 2 minutes until they're in effective range." Powell dragged O'Connor away from the exposed ramp. "Comms?" Ford was already wrestling with the PRC-117 radio. He slammed a fresh battery into the unit, thumbing the handset. Nothing. Antennas sheared off, Chief. We're in a bowl. Even if I can get a wire rigged, the rock faces are bouncing the signal. We are black on comms. A single 7.62mm round pinged off the titanium armor near Kala's head, sounding like a hammer striking an anvil. The engagement had begun. Kala raised her rifle, settling the red dot on a chest cavity bounding between two boulders. She squeezed the trigger. The suppressed weapon barked. The figure dropped. "One down," she murmured, scanning for the next target. 70 to go. Powell cursed, drawing his weapon and moving to the opposite window. "Ford, get that radio working. Hensley, watch the rear ramp. O'Connor, stay low and load magazines." The valley erupted. The initial probing shots turned into a concentrated barrage. Bullets drummed against the Osprey's hull like hail. The armor held, but the plexiglass windows shattered inward, showering the deck with sharp, glittering diamonds. The SEALs returned fire in controlled, disciplined bursts. They were elite, a machine built for violence, but the math was against them. They were outgunned, outmanned, and immobilized in a metallic coffin on a frozen mountaintop. Kala changed magazines smoothly, her muscle memory taking over. She dropped another hostile, trying to flank their right side. But for every one she put down, 3 more seemed to emerge from the dense tree line. They were using the terrain perfectly, moving from cover to cover, setting up a base of fire. "Chief," Kala called out over the din of automatic fire. "They're setting up a DSHK heavy machine gun on that lower ridge. Once that's operational, this armor won't mean shit." Powell knew it. A 12.7mm round would cut through the fuselage and turn the interior into a meat grinder. He looked around the cabin. His men were bleeding, trapped, and heavily outnumbered. Hiking out was impossible. The snow was too deep, the wounded too slow, and the enemy too close. "Hold them off!" Powell shouted. He turned and scrambled up the tilted deck towards the cockpit. The heavy armored door was wedged shut, the frame warped by the crash. Powell braced his back against the bulkhead and kicked it with both boots. The lock snapped. He tumbled into the cockpit. It was a slaughterhouse. The armored glass had taken multiple bird strikes of high-caliber rounds during the descent. The pilot and co-pilot had caught the brunt of it. They were gone. The instrument panels were a mess of shattered gauges, blinking amber warnings, and slick blood. Powell grabbed the pilot by the harness, trying to see if there was any life left. Nothing. He checked the co-pilot. Dead. He stared at the center console. The primary MFDs, multifunction displays, were cracked but still glowing. The throttle quadrant was intact. The right engine was dead, destroyed by the missile, but the left engine's readouts were surprisingly stable. The APU was still running, whining softly beneath the roar of the gunfight outside. The bird wasn't dead. It was crippled, bleeding and grounded, but it had a pulse. Powell backed out of the cockpit, his hands coated in the pilot's blood. He slid back down into the main cabin, just as a rocket-propelled grenade slammed into the snowbank outside, rocking the fuselage and showering them all with icy debris. They had maybe 3 minutes before the DSHK opened up and turned them into a memory. Powell knelt in the center of the cabin, the heavy thump of hostile fire beating against the walls. He looked at his team. Ford was frantically splicing wires together with bloody fingers. Hensley was ghost pale, firing his weapon with one hand while pressing a dressing to his side with the other. O'Connor was awkwardly packing magazines with his good arm, and Kala was positioned by the door, her face an unreadable mask of focus as she sent controlled pairs into the approaching tree line. They were the best of the best. Ground combat experts, breachers, snipers, medics. None of them were pilots. Powell wiped the blood from his hands onto his trousers. The desperation in his chest was a cold, expanding knot. He had to make a call, and all the options ended in body bags. "The pilots are gone!" Powell yelled, his voice cutting through a brief lull in the firing. "The left engine is hot. The APU is running. The rotors aren't locked." He looked at the men, then at Calla. "Can anyone fly this?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the smoke. It was absurd. It was like asking a carpenter to perform open-heart surgery. A CV-22 Osprey wasn't a truck. It wasn't even a helicopter. It was a notoriously temperamental, hybridized nightmare of fly-by-wire software, complex aerodynamics, and tilt-rotor mechanics. Men with thousands of hours of flight time respected it. Many feared it. Ford paused his splicing. Hensley stopped firing. O'Connor looked up from the magazines. For a split second, the combat outside seemed to fade into white noise. They were SEALs. They operated on the edge of the impossible. But they knew their limits. You didn't just hop into an Osprey and figure it out on the fly. "Chief," Ford started, his voice strained. "That's a tilt-rotor. We don't—" "I know what it is," Powell snapped, the panic finally edging into his tone. "The heavy gun is almost up. We are out of time." A burst of fire chewed through the thin aluminum skin near the tail, forcing them all to duck. Calla dropped an empty magazine onto the deck. She didn't immediately reach for a fresh one. Instead, she flipped her rifle's selector switch to safe and let it hang on its sling. She turned away from the door. She rose to her feet. Everyone froze. The team watched her, stunned. Not because she was a woman. They had long ago stopped seeing her as anything other than Glitch, their heavy weapons and breaching specialist, who could haul 100 pounds of gear up a mountain without breaking a sweat. They froze because Calla Davies was the quietest person in the platoon. She spoke in grunts, nods, and the occasional dry sarcasm. She didn't brag. She didn't volunteer for the spotlight. And she certainly wasn't a pilot. "Davies," Powell said, his voice dropping an octave. "What are you doing?" "Taking the left seat, Chief," Calla said. Her voice was steady, utterly devoid of the adrenaline that was frying everyone else's nerves. "You don't know how to fly that bird," O'Connor breathed, clutching his broken arm. Calla stepped over the shattered remains of a storage crate, moving towards the cockpit door. "Before I was Navy, I was Army. 161st SAW, Night Stalkers." Powell blinked, processing the information. "You flew?" "Little birds, MH6s, Calla corrected, stepping into the bloody threshold of the cockpit. "I got bored." "An MH6 is not a tilt-rotor," Ford yelled over the gunfire. "This thing will kill us faster than they will." Calla didn't look back. "I dated a guy at Hurlburt Field who flew these. He talked a lot. I read the manuals so I could tell him when he was wrong. It was a ridiculous statement, delivered with absolute, deadpan sincerity. Under any other circumstances, someone would have laughed. Now it was the only lifeline they had. "Get in the seat," Powell roared, snapping out of his shock. "Ford, Hensley, lay down suppressing fire. Buy her 30 seconds. Calla slid into the pilot's seat. The smell of blood was overwhelming, thick and metallic. She unceremoniously pushed the dead pilot's arm off the center console. She didn't have time to be gentle or respectful. She needed the real estate. She stared at the instrument panel. It was a mess of shattered glass and glowing screens. To an untrained eye, it was chaos. To Calla, it was a puzzle missing half its pieces, but the edges were still visible. "Okay, Glitch, remember the book." Her hands flew over the overhead panel. She bypassed the damaged right engine's fuel lines, isolating the system to prevent a fire. She engaged the backup flight control computers. The Osprey's fly-by-wire system was a triple redundant beast. If she could convince the computer they weren't dead, it might let her fly. "Come on, you ugly bastard," she whispered. She gripped the thrust control lever with her left hand and the cyclic stick with her right. The controls felt foreign, heavy, and sluggish. Outside, the unmistakable, terrifying boom of the DSK heavy machine gun echoed across the valley. Thump, thump, thump. A line of 12.7mm rounds tore through the snow just yards from the nose of the aircraft. "Davies!" Powell screamed from the cabin. "I'm working on it," she yelled back. She checked the nacelle angle. The left engine was still tilted at a 45-degree angle from the crash. She needed it vertical for takeoff, or they would just drag themselves further into the dirt. She found the thumb wheel on the thrust lever and rolled it back. Hydraulics whined in protest. A grinding shudder vibrated through the airframe. The left nacelle, groaning against bent metal, slowly rotated upward to 90 degrees. Warning: right engine failure. Warning: rotor sync error. The automated female voice of the flight computer filled the cockpit, maddeningly calm. Kala hit the master caution override button. "Shut up!" She looked at the engine torque display. With only one protor, the aircraft was completely unbalanced. A normal pilot wouldn't try to lift off. The bird would just roll over and crush itself. But Kala wasn't a normal pilot. She was a breacher. She knew about applied force. She knew that if you push hard enough, physics sometimes blinks first. She needed to trick the flight computer. She cross-tied the drive shafts, a desperate maneuver that forced the surviving left engine to power both the left and the damaged right rotor systems. The engine screamed, a high-pitched, deafening wail that shook dust from the ceiling. "Hold on!" Kala shouted over the intercom. She slammed the thrust lever forward. The Osprey didn't lift. It convulsed. The left side tore free from the snowbank, lifting 3 feet into the air, while the right side, heavy and dragging, scraped against the granite. The aircraft began to spin violently on its axis, a wounded animal thrashing in a trap. In the back, Powell and the team were thrown to the deck, desperately holding on to anything bolted down as the cabin became a centrifuge. Through the cracked windshield, Kala saw the heavy machine gun nest. They were reloading. She had exactly 2 seconds before they adjusted aim and put a round through her face. She didn't try to fight the spin. She used it. She kicked the left rudder pedal hard, accelerating the chaotic rotation. The tail swung around, smashing into the boulder that was pinning their right wing. The impact shattered the rock, freeing the wing. In that split second of freedom, Kala pulled the cyclic hard right and jammed the thrust to maximum. The single engine roared past its red line. The temperature gauges flashed critical. The Osprey tore itself from the earth. The sky did not welcome them. It fought them every inch of the way. The Osprey lurched upward into the thin mountain air, a wounded 30-ton insect missing half its wings. The moment they cleared the immediate ridgeline, the wind caught them. A heavy downdraft slammed onto the fuselage, pushing the aircraft back toward the granite teeth of the Hindu Kush. In the pilot's seat, Kala Davies stopped being a SEAL and became a purely mechanical component of the dying machine. Her right arm, gripping the cyclic, was trembling violently. The single operational engine was channeling an impossible amount of torque through the interconnect driveshaft. The vibration wasn't just shaking the cockpit, it was blurring her vision. It felt like holding a jackhammer bare-handed. "Altitude! We need altitude!" Powell yelled from the cabin, his voice barely cutting through the deafening roar of the overstressed turbine. "I know," Kala grunted through clenched teeth. She pushed the thrust lever forward, ignoring the blinking red warning lights that dominated the instrument panel. Gearbox overtemp, shaft degrade, hydraulic fail. The automated warning voice was a constant, flat drone in her headset. She reached up and physically ripped the master caution audio wire from the console. The silence that followed was entirely relative, replaced by the screaming metal of the airframe. The left nacelle was locked vertically, acting like a traditional helicopter rotor, but the destroyed right side was dead drag. The only thing keeping them from rolling inverted and plummeting into the valley was the cross-tie system, and it was melting under the friction. The smell of burning transmission fluid filled the cabin, thick and nauseating. Below them, the hostile forces were rapidly shrinking into dark specks against the snow. But tracer rounds still floated upward, lazy, glowing arcs that snapped past the cracked windshield. "Ford! Comms!" Calla shouted over her shoulder. Ford was braced against a bulkhead, holding the radio handset. "I'm trying. The bounce is scattering the signal." "Try harder. If the interconnect shaft snaps, we become a brick. I give it 10 minutes before the gearbox turns to slag. 10 minutes. It was a death sentence delivered with the casual tone of a weather report. In the cabin, gravity played a brutal game. The Osprey wasn't flying level. It was crab-walking through the sky at a sickening 30-degree tilt. Blood from the dead pilots ran in a slow, sticky river down the center console, pooling at Kayla's boots. Powell dragged himself across the slanted deck, grabbing a cargo net for stability. He checked on O'Connor. The younger SEAL was pale, sweating profusely, his broken arm strapped tightly to his chest. Hensley was worse. The gunshot wound to his side was bleeding through the thick trauma dressing. "Stay with me, Hensley," Powell growled, pressing his hand over the wound. "You don't get to die in a crashed bird. That's aviation's job. We die in the mud like professionals." Hensley let out a wet, rattling chuckle that ended in a cough. "Copy that, Chief." Powell looked toward the cockpit. From his angle, he could only see the back of Calla's helmet and her forearms. The muscles in her arms were corded, locked in a brutal wrestling match with the flight controls. She was physically fighting the aerodynamics of a machine that desperately wanted to crash. Every gust of wind required a massive, exhausting overcorrection just to keep the nose pointed forward. "Glitch!" Powell called out, using her call sign for the first time that day. "Where are we going?" "Following the river draw south," Calla replied, her breathing ragged. "It's a natural funnel, cuts through the peaks. I can't climb over the mountains. The engine doesn't have the lift. We have to fly through them." It was a suicidal navigation plan. The river draw was narrow, flanked by sheer rock walls that offered zero margin for error. In a fully functioning aircraft, it would be a risky nap-of-the-earth flight. In a dying tilt-rotor flying sideways, it was madness. "Do it," Powell said. The Osprey dipped into the canyon. The rock walls rose on either side, terrifyingly close. Shadows swallowed the aircraft as they descended into the gorge. The river below was a churning ribbon of white water. Calla kept the altitude at a precarious 200 feet. Any higher, and they hit the canyon walls. Any lower, and the ground effect would destabilize the single functioning rotor. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Ford's voice suddenly crackled. Not just in the cabin, but over the internal comms loop. He had spliced the radio directly into the aircraft's surviving antenna array. "This is Vulture 2-6. Any station on this net, authenticate and respond." Static. Then a voice. "Vulture 2-6. This is Outpost Keating. We read you weak and garbled. State your emergency. Aircraft is crippled. We are flying on half a wing. Heavy casualties. Requesting immediate vector to nearest friendly tarmac." "Copy, Vulture 2-6. We have you on radar. You are 20 miles north of FOB Shank. Be advised, Shank does not have a medical runway. It's a dirt strip. It'll have to do, Calla interrupted, keying her mic. Have crash and rescue on the line. We are coming in hot, and we don't have landing gear. Vulture 26, confirm pilot. Your call sign does not match the manifest. Calla stared at the canyon wall rushing past the windshield. Pilot is dead. I'm the breacher. Make sure there's a foam truck waiting. A long pause hung over the radio. Then, copy that, Vulture 26, Godspeed. 5 miles out. The interconnect drive shaft finally began to die. It started as a high-pitched metallic squeal, like a train braking on rusted tracks, and quickly escalated into a violent, rhythmic shudder. The entire airframe groaned. Rivets popped from the overhead panels, raining small aluminum discs onto the deck. Gearbox temperature is critical, Calla shouted. The controls were stiffening. The hydraulic fluid was boiling. It's seizing. Brace for impact. Hold it together, Davies, Powell yelled, bracing his boots against a seat strut and throwing his body over Hensley to protect him. Through the cracked plexiglass, the dusty, sprawling expanse of forward operating base, Shank, came into view. It sat in a shallow valley, surrounded by HESCO barriers and concertina wire. In the center of the base was a single, long dirt airstrip. Fire trucks and armored medical vehicles were already racing toward the threshold, their lights flashing in the dusk. I don't have the power to hover, Calla yelled, her voice straining as she fought the cyclic. I have to do a run-on landing. It's going to be rough. It was a massive understatement. An Osprey run-on landing is dangerous with gear. Without gear, dragging a shattered wing and a dead engine, it was a controlled crash. Just put us in the dirt, Glitch, O'Connor yelled. Calla dropped the nose. The airspeed indicator hovered at 120 knots. Too fast. She pulled back on the cyclic to flare, trying to bleed off speed, but the sluggish controls fought her. The ground rushed up to meet them, a blur of brown dust and gravel. 50 feet, 20 feet. Brace! Calla screamed. She cut the fuel line to the single functioning engine. Better to drop out of the sky than burn on the ground. The turbine died. The rotors lost their driving force, relying purely on their remaining momentum. The Osprey dropped like an anvil. They hit the dirt. The impact was catastrophic. The belly of the aircraft slammed into the packed earth of the runway. Because the landing gear was gone, the fuselage took the full, brutal force of the landing. The aircraft skidded, a horrific screech of tearing titanium echoing across the base. The destroyed right wing dug into the dirt first. It acted as an anchor, snapping the aircraft violently to the right. The Osprey spun as it slid, a massive 30-ton centrifuge of screaming metal and dust. Inside the cabin, it was a washing machine of violence. Gear bags, loose ammunition, and debris flew through the air like shrapnel. Calla was thrown violently against her harness, her helmet smashing into the side window. Sparks showered through the cockpit as the floorboards ground away against the runway. For 10 agonizing seconds, the world was nothing but noise, fire, and kinetic fury. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire on the mountain. It was absolute. The dust settled over the shattered airframe, coating the cracked windows in a thick, brown film. Calla sat perfectly still. Her hands were locked onto the cyclic and thrust lever in a death grip. Her knuckles were bone white. Her breathing came in short, jagged gasps. She stared straight ahead at the dirt covering the windshield. Sound off, a rough, gravelly voice echoed from the back. Powell, Ford, alive. O'Connor, still broken. Hensley, yeah, still here. Footsteps crunched heavily on the gravel outside. The sounds of shouting reached them. "Over here! Bring the jaws! Foam the right engine!" Base personnel were swarming the wreckage. The rear ramp, warped and jammed, was violently pried open by a rescue team. Paramedics flooded the cabin, their voices a chaotic blur of medical jargon. Powell didn't look at the medics. He climbed the slanted, debris-strewn deck toward the cockpit. He found Calla still sitting in the pilot's seat. She hadn't moved. The rescue workers were trying to pry the armored door open from the outside, but it was wedged tight against the dirt. "Davies," Powell said quietly. She didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the dead instrument panel. Powell stepped over the bodies of the pilots, bracing himself against the bulkhead. He reached out and placed his hand over hers on the cyclic stick. Her muscles were rigid, locked in a state of tetany from the sheer physical and psychological exertion of the flight. "Glitch," Powell said, his voice softer, devoid of the harsh edge of command. "Let it go. The flight's over." Slowly, agonizingly, her fingers uncurled. She pulled her hands back. They were shaking so violently she had to press them against her tactical vest to steady them. She unbuckled her harness, the metal clasp clicking loudly in the quiet cockpit. She looked at Powell. Her face was smeared with soot, sweat, and the blood of the men whose seats she had taken. There was no triumph in her eyes, no relief, just the hollow, cynical exhaustion of someone who had looked death in the face and won on a technicality. "I'm out of practice," she muttered, her voice raspy. Powell let out a short, breathy sound that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. He gripped her shoulder, his fingers digging into the Kevlar. "Walk away, Glitch. Let the medics do their job." Calla nodded once. She climbed out of the seat, stepping carefully over the blood and shattered glass. As she emerged from the cockpit and moved toward the blinding sunlight pouring through the open rear ramp, a young Air Force paramedic rushed up to her. "Ma'am, are you injured?" "Where's the pilot?" the kid asked, panic in his eyes as he looked at the ruined front half of the bird. Calla pushed past him, her boots crunching heavily on the tarmac. She didn't look back at the wreckage. "Pilot's dead," she said flatly. "I'm just the breacher." If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button to let us know. We bring you intense, character-driven military dramas every week, so don't forget to share this video with your friends and subscribe to the channel. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below and tell us which part of Calla's insane flight had your heart pounding the most.